I have been alone for 3 days now. Though the Vox never stops screaming, they tell you in training that communication is the lifeblood of the regiment. They teach you the litanies of connection, the prayers to the machine god for clear signals, the proper way to cradle a handset so the sweat from your palm doesn't corrode the contacts. They tell you that you will be the voice that binds squad to command, that your words will save lives, that you are essential. What they don't tell you is how the voices begin to change. How after enough hours in the trench with the Vox unit's green phosphor glow painting your face, you start to hear things that weren't transmitted. How loneliness isn't the absence of voices, but their terrible, unending presence. My name was Trooper Hadris Ven, Vox Operator 3rd Class, attached to the 71st Khalistan Infantry Regiment. I say was, because I'm not certain what I am anymore. The designation feels like something that belonged to someone else, someone who existed before the bombardment, collapsed the command bunker, and left me buried in this junction point, with a functioning Vox unit, and no way out. That was 72 hours ago, though I've lost faith in my chronometer. Time moves strangely when you're alone. When you're not alone, the junction is 8 feet wide, and perhaps 15 long, carved into the clay soil of this wretched world whose name I've forgotten. Wooden support beams angle overhead, weeping moisture that smells of rot and chemicals. My lamp, a standard-issue luminator running on a power cell that should have died yesterday, throws shadows that seem to move when I'm not looking directly at them. The Vox unit sits on an upturned ammunition crate, its dials and switches forming a face that watches me with brass eyes. Around me, the detritus of war. Empty ration tins, a broken lasrifle, someone's prayer beads tangled in the mud, a boot with the foot still in it. I don't look at the boot anymore. The Vox crackles. It always crackles. Static patterns that rise and fall like breathing, interrupted by fragments of transmission. I maintain my log because that's what we do. That's what I was trained to do. At 0400 hours estimated, I received a partial message from someone claiming to be Captain Roth of 2nd Company. The voice was wrong. Too high. Too eager. Captain Roth died in the first week of the campaign. I logged his death myself, heard the last fire over an open channel as his position was overrun. But the voice kept insisting, kept asking for coordinates, kept saying they were coming to extract me. I didn't answer. You learn quickly which voices are real. The regiment had been on this world for 4 months before the collapse. A fortress world. They told us during the transport drop. Strategically vital to the subsector. The enemy, we were never given details about the enemy, just told they were heretics, who'd rejected the Emperor's light, had fortified the northern wastes, and our job was to dig them out, trench by trench, bunker by bunker. The 71st was good at digging. We'd done it on 6 worlds before this one. I'd been with them for 2 years, long enough to stop learning names, because names became casualties, and casualties became statistics, and statistics became the white noise between transmissions. I was good at my job. I had fast hands and a good ear. I could distinguish between Vox channels by the quality of their static, could recognize officers by the rhythm of their breathing before they spoke. Lieutenant Meris always paused before keying his handset, a half-second of hesitation that spoke of careful thought. Sergeant Yannick coughed twice before every transmission, a wet rattle from lungs damaged by industrial toxins on his homeworld. Private Des hummed unconsciously, I think a fragment of a hymn his mother had taught him. All of them are gone now. I know because I heard them die. Not all at once. That would have been merciful. The bombardment started at what I'd logged as 1,730 hours, 3 days ago. Heavy ordnance, the kind that made the earth heave and the support beams groan. I was in the command bunker with Major Kellick and his staff, a relatively safe position 30 feet below ground. The Vox unit was the newest model, a Vox Lux Mark 7 with triple redundant power systems and a transmission range of 50 miles in optimal conditions. The Major wanted constant updates from all forward positions, wanted to know the disposition of every squad, every heavy weapons team, every sentry post. The first shells hit the forward trenches. I heard Sergeant Yannick's voice cut off mid-transmission, replaced by a sound like cloth tearing. Then silence on that channel. I noted it in my log. Forward position Gamma, no contact. I moved to the next channel. Lieutenant Meris was shouting coordinates, his careful hesitation gone, replaced by something sharp and animal. I heard the whine of descending ordnance through his handset before the signal dissolved into white noise. Channel after channel went dark. I logged each one dutifully, my hands steady, my voice calm as I reported to Major Kellick. This is what we do. We maintain protocol. We follow procedure. Even as the world ends, we file proper reports. Then the bunker took a direct hit. I remember the sound, a thunderclap that turned solid, that became a physical thing crushing down. The support beams shattered. The lights died. Someone was screaming, though I couldn't tell if it was the major or his adjutant or the runner who'd been bringing fresh batteries. The earth moved, a slow, inevitable motion like a great beast rolling over in sleep, and I felt myself falling, sliding down through collapsing soil and splintered wood. My arms wrapped around the Vox unit instinctively. They drilled that into us. Protect the equipment. Your life is replaceable. Communication is eternal. I woke in darkness so absolute it had texture. For a long time, minutes, hours, I simply lay there, listening to dirt trickle and timber settle, and my own heart hammering against my ribs. Then I realized I could hear something else. The Vox unit, still powered, its speaker emitting a soft hiss of carrier static. I'd fallen into a junction point, a connecting passage between trench lines that had somehow survived the collapse. Above me, tons of earth and shattered wood. Around me, a tomb that happened to have air. The Vox unit still worked. I could still hear the regiment. What remained of it? I spent the first few hours after waking in a kind of automated efficiency. I checked my equipment. Luminator functional, power cell at 87%. Sidearm present, 1 clip of ammunition. Ration pack, half consumed. Water flask, 3/4 full. The Vox unit showed green indicators across all primary systems. I had 12 channels programmed, regimental frequencies assigned to different companies and specialist units. I began checking each one systematically, calling for response, listening for replies. Nothing on Channel 1. Static on Channel 2. Channel 3 gave me a voice. Private Helvan from 3rd Company. I thought, but the transmission was fragmented, words buried under interference that sounded like whispers. I requested clarification. The voice said something that might have been coordinates, or might have been a prayer. Then silence. Channel 4 gave me breathing. Just breathing. Heavy and wet, like someone running or wounded or both. I called out, "This is Command Vox. Identify yourself." The breathing continued. I thought I could hear, underneath it, a very distant sound like machinery or chanting. I tried again. "Report your status and position." The breathing became a laugh. At least, I think it was a laugh, and then the channel went dead. I moved on. This is what we do. By the end of that first day, I'd established that 11 of my 12 channels were compromised or silent. Only Channel 9, the General Command frequency, maintained any regular traffic, and even that was wrong. The voices I heard were requesting orders from officers I knew were dead, reporting attacks on positions that had been overrun weeks ago, describing enemy movements that made no tactical sense. I logged each transmission carefully, noting inconsistencies, trying to build a picture of what was happening above ground. The picture I built was impossible. On the second day, I realized I was hungry. The ration pack was standard issue. Protein paste in a silver tube, a handful of carbohydrate wafers that tasted of sweetened chalk, a vitamin tab that fizzed and dissolved in my water flask. I ate slowly, methodically, making it last. Rations are precious on the front. You learn to savor every calorie, to make peace with perpetual hunger. The paste tasted of meat, though I'd long since stopped wondering what kind. I tried to dig. The collapse had left me in what I could now see, by the green-tinged light of the Vox unit's dials and my luminator's narrow beam, was a relatively intact passage. One end terminated in a solid wall of compacted earth and shattered timber. The other end curved away into darkness, but after 10 feet, it too was blocked. I picked at the earthen wall with my hands, then with a piece of broken wood, then with the bayonet from the broken lazarifal. The soil was dense, clayey, reinforced with roots from the scrubby vegetation that covered this world's surface. After an hour of work, I'd cleared perhaps a handful of material. I stopped digging. Math is simple when you're buried alive. I had 72 hours of air, maybe 96, if I remained still and breathed shallowly. I had food for perhaps 3 days, water for 2. I could dig for months and not break through. The earth above me might extend 50 feet, might extend 100. I had no way of knowing if I was excavating toward the surface or deeper into the ground. So I sat with the Vox unit and listened to the voices. They came in waves, long stretches of static, punctuated by sudden bursts of activity. I heard a woman's voice, which was unusual. The 71st was all male, reading what sounded like supply manifests, listing items I didn't recognize. 17 units of distilled essence, 48 jars of preserved thinking, 9 miles of threaded consciousness. I logged it dutifully, though I had no context for the words. I heard someone singing, a low, droning chant, in a language I didn't recognize, though certain words seemed to burrow into my ears with strange familiarity. The song went on for what might have been hours, never repeating, never pausing for breath, until I finally switched channels to escape it. But later, I found myself humming it. The melody was there in my mind, complete and intricate, though I couldn't remember learning it. I heard Private Des. I recognized his voice immediately, that slight lisp he'd had since childhood, the way he elongated certain vowels in the accent of his homeworld. He was giving a status report from forward position Delta. His squad was intact, he said, ammunition supplies adequate, morale stable. They were holding the line. He sounded proud. He sounded alive. I'd watched Private Des die 6 weeks ago. A sniper's last bolt had taken him through the throat, while he was climbing out of a trench. I'd seen his body dragged back to the aid station, seen the flesh of his neck cauterized into a blackened crater, seen them wrap him in a standard-issue shroud and add him to the pile. I keyed my handset. Private Des, this is Command Vox. Confirm your identity. Command Vox, this is Private Des, 3rd Squad, 2nd Platoon, 4th Company. The voice was perfect, every inflection right. We're holding the line here. Tell the captain we're holding. Private Des, I said slowly. What is your squad leader's name? A pause. Static. Then, tell the captain, we're holding the line. What is your squad leader's name? We're holding the line. We're holding. Tell the captain. Tell him we're... The transmission dissolved into interference that might have been screaming, or might have been laughter, or might have been the sound of something wet being torn. I noted it in my log. Channel 7, 1000, 420 hours, estimated, unconfirmed contact, claiming to be deceased personnel, possible Vox malfunction. Then I sat very still and tried not to think about the fact that Private Des's voice had known the exact organizational structure of a squad that no longer existed, had used the proper protocols for status reports, had sounded genuinely eager for approval. The boot in the corner, the one with the foot still in it, had belonged to a man named Corporal Vass. I knew this because his identification tags were still visible, looped around the ankle, stamped metal glinting in the luminator's beam. I'd served with Vass for 8 months. He'd been a quiet man, efficient, the kind of soldier who followed orders without question and died without complaint. The boot was the only piece of him that had made it into this junction. The rest was somewhere up there, under tons of earth, feeding the planet's soil. I thought about Vass often on the second day, wondered if he'd been afraid at the end, wondered if he'd felt the bunker collapse, or if death had come quickly, mercifully. Wondered if some fragment of him was still up there, still clutching a Vox handset, still trying to report to an officer who no longer existed. I wondered if I was any different. The air was getting stale. I could feel it in my lungs, a thickness that made each breath slightly more laborious than the last. The Luminator's beam had begun to dim, power cell draining despite being rated for 60 hours of continuous use. I'd started rationing its use, leaving myself in darkness for long stretches, using only the green glow of the Vox unit's dials. The darkness was alive with sounds, dripping water, settling earth, the scurry of something that might have been rats, or might have been something else. I'd seen what rats looked like on this world. They were pale things with too many legs and eyes that reflected Luminator light, like tiny mirrors. The Vox gave me a new voice on the evening of the second day, a man who identified himself as Commissar Throne. He wanted a status report on troop morale. He spoke with the clipped, authoritative tone of the commissariat, that particular blend of menace and certainty that marked those who enforced loyalty with bolt rounds. I'd met commissars. They visited the regiment periodically, black-coated figures who watched for heresy, listened for doubt, executed anyone who showed weakness. All positions report stable morale, I told him, reciting the expected response. It was what any Vox operator would say. You don't tell a commissar that morale is low. You don't admit that soldiers are afraid, or that officers are incompetent, or that the whole campaign is grinding toward futility. You smile and lie, and hope he doesn't notice. Excellent, said Commissar Throne. And what of your morale, Trooper Ven? The use of my name stopped me. I hadn't identified myself. I'd given my unit designation Command Vox, but nothing else. The voice on the channel shouldn't have known who I was. My morale is adequate, Commissar. You sound uncertain. Uncertainty is the first step toward heresy. I am certain in my faith in the Emperor, Commissar. A long pause filled with static. Then, but are you certain in your faith in yourself? Are you certain that you still exist, Trooper Ven? Or are you merely a voice in the dark, pretending to be human? I didn't answer. I couldn't answer. The question had touched something I'd been avoiding, a thought that had been circling in the back of my mind since the collapse. I was alone in the dark, speaking to voices that shouldn't exist, hearing the dead report from positions that had been abandoned. How did I know I was real? How did I know this wasn't death? Wasn't some purgatorial state where souls lingered in the wreckage of their final moments? I can hear your doubt, said the voice of Commissar Throne. It sounds like static. It sounds like fear. Shall I come down there and absolve you, Trooper? Shall I bring my bolt pistol and administer the Emperor's mercy? I switched channels. The new frequency was silent at first. Just carrier static, pure and clean. I sat listening to it, letting the white noise fill my head, drowning out the questions. Static is honest. Static is real. It's the sound of the universe continuing to exist even when nothing is being said, the proof that somewhere, somehow, energy is still moving through circuits and air. Then, very quietly, I heard breathing again. The same heavy, wet breathing from Channel 4. But this time, I thought I could hear words underneath it, a voice speaking very softly, almost subvocally, forming syllables that didn't quite resolve into meaning. I leaned closer to the handset, straining to catch the words. Should have dug deeper, the voice whispered. Should have dug down instead of across. Down is where the truth is. Down is where we're all going eventually. Identify yourself, I demanded. The breathing stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own pulse in my ears, a rhythmic thud that matched the blinking of the Vox unit's power indicator. Then, I'm you, Hadris. I'm what you'll be when you finally understand. I dropped the handset. It clattered against the ammunition crate, still emitting that soft, terrible breathing. I backed away from the Vox unit, pressing myself against the earthen wall, feeling the cold dampness seep through my uniform. This was wrong. This was all wrong. Vox units transmitted voices. They didn't create them. They didn't know things. They were just machines, just brass and wire, and sacred circuitry blessed by tech priests and maintained according to the manual of communications. But the voice had known my name. Both voices had known my name. I stayed away from the Vox for what might have been hours. I sat in the darkness, conserving my Luminator's power, listening to the earth settle around me. I thought about the training facility on Callisto Prime where they'd taught me Vox operation. I thought about the liturgies we'd recited, the prayers to the machine god that supposedly blessed our equipment. I thought about Instructor Carnis, a severe woman with augmetic eyes, who'd told us that a good Vox operator was a medium between worlds, a conduit for voices that needed to be heard. You will hear many things, she'd said. Some will be orders, some will be lies, some will be the screams of the dying. Your job is not to judge. Your job is to listen and to transmit. You are a voice vessel. You are sacred machinery in human form. At the time, I'd thought she was speaking metaphorically. Now, I wasn't sure. The Vox crackled to life without me touching it. I heard a new voice, or perhaps an old voice. I couldn't tell any more reading coordinates. A string of numbers that made no sense. That described positions in a three-dimensional space that couldn't exist on any map I knew. Latitude, longitude, altitude, and then other measurements, other axes that had no names. The voice read them with perfect precision, never pausing, never hesitating. I crawled back to the unit. My log needed updating. This is what we do. We maintain records. Even if the records make no sense, even if we're documenting something impossible, we write it down because documentation is civilization, is the thing that separates us from beasts. I picked up my stylus and began noting the coordinates, scratching numbers into the margin of my logbook. As I wrote, I noticed something. The coordinates were changing in a pattern. Each new set of numbers was slightly different from the last, but the changes followed a progression, a mathematical sequence that I couldn't quite grasp but could sense hovering at the edge of comprehension. It was like looking at a shape in peripheral vision that vanished when you tried to focus on it. I plotted the coordinates on a blank page, drawing a grid, marking points. Lines began to emerge, connecting in ways that hurt to look at. The shape they formed was wrong, was a geometry that shouldn't be possible in three-dimensional space. But the more I drew, the more sense it made, as if my mind was adapting to perceive something it hadn't been designed to see. The shape was moving, growing. The new coordinates were tracking its expansion, measuring its approach through dimensions I didn't have names for, and it was getting closer to where I was buried. I stopped drawing. I closed the logbook and pushed it away from me, as if distance could make the shape I'd plotted less real. My hands were shaking. When had they started shaking? I pressed them against my thighs, trying to still them, but they had a tremor now, a constant fine vibration like an engine idling. The Vox gave me Lieutenant Meris next. His voice was exactly as I remembered, calm, measured, with that half-second pause before speaking. He wanted a situation report. He wanted to know the status of all forward elements. His voice was so normal, so sane, that for a moment I almost believed, almost thought that maybe I'd been wrong about his death, that maybe the signal I'd heard cut off had been just interference, that maybe he'd survived and was still up there coordinating the defense. "Lieutenant," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is Trooper Venn, Command Vox. I'm trapped in a junction point beneath the command bunker. I need immediate extraction. Can you send a recovery team?" The pause, the exact right length, the pause that said he was considering, analyzing, planning. Then, "Negative, Trooper. All recovery teams are committed to forward operations. You'll need to maintain position and await relief. Sir, I have limited supplies. Air quality is degrading. I estimate 48 hours before. Maintain position, Trooper." That's an order. It was the right answer. It was exactly what a lieutenant would say when resources were scarce and the mission was critical. Individual soldiers were expendable. The regiment was eternal. This was doctrine, was theology, was the mathematics of war. But something was wrong with the way he said it. "Lieutenant, When did you last receive a general situation update? Another pause. This one slightly too long. Updates are continuous, Trooper. The situation is fluid. What's the current date, sir? Silence. Static. Then his voice came back, but it was different now. The measured calm replaced by something else, something that might have been confusion or might have been anger. Why are you asking me questions? Trooper? Why aren't you following orders? Do you doubt? Is there weakness in you? No, sir. Weakness is heresy. Doubt is death. Maintain your position. Listen to the voices. We're all listening, Trooper Ven. We're all listening together, down in the dark where the truth is. The channel dissolved into white noise that sounded like screaming. I sat with my back against the wall and tried to remember what day it was, what month, what year. I'd been with the regiment for 2 years. Before that, training on Callisto Prime. Before that, a childhood on some hive world, whose name I'd tried to forget because remembering where you came from was pointless when you'd been tithed to the Imperial Guard. I'd had a mother once, I thought. A father. Siblings maybe. But those memories were distant, unreal, like stories someone had told me about another person. What was real was the Vox. The voices. The logbook with its careful notations documenting the impossible. I was on my 3rd day now, though I'd lost confidence in my timekeeping. The chronometer strapped to my wrist showed numbers that seemed right, but I'd caught myself staring at it for what felt like hours, watching the seconds tick by, and when I looked away and then back, the time had barely advanced. Or sometimes it jumped forward, losing minutes I couldn't account for. My water was gone. The last drops from the flask had been warm and tasted of metal and plastic. My mouth was dry, tongue thick. I'd read about dehydration in the guard manual. 3 days without water. That was the estimate. After that, the body began shutting down, prioritizing essential functions, abandoning the periphery. I wondered which parts of me were peripheral. My hands still shook. My legs had gone numb from sitting. When I tried to stand, the world tilted, and I had to clutch the Vox unit's crate for balance. The unit itself seemed to pulse with heat, though that might have been fever. I'd developed a headache that lived behind my eyes, a constant pressure that made looking at the Luminator's beam painful. The voices kept coming. I heard Sergeant Yannick explaining a flanking maneuver to troops I knew were dead. I heard someone crying, just crying, no words, just the sound of despair given voice. I heard machinery grate grinding mechanisms that sounded like they were chewing through metal and bone. I heard prayers in High Gothic, the words formal and correct, but when I listened closely, I realized the prayers were backwards, were starting at the end and working toward the beginning, unmaking the meaning as they went. And I heard silence. That was the worst. The channels would go dead, completely dead. No static, no carrier wave, just nothing. And in that nothing, I could feel something listening, something that lived in the spaces between transmissions, that fed on the absence of sound. I need to tell you about what I found on the morning of the 3rd day, though morning is just a word I'm using for the period after I woke from what might have been sleep. The Luminator had finally died, power cell exhausted despite its rating. I was in complete darkness now, except for the green glow of the Vox unit's dials. That glow seemed brighter than it should have been, seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched something I couldn't quite identify. My heartbeat, maybe. Or something else's. I'd begun exploring the junction by feel, hands running over the earthen walls, mapping the space by touch. That's when I found the gap. A narrow fissure in the wall at the curved end of the passage, a split in the packed earth that my fingers could penetrate. Cool air moved through it, a draft that smelled of depths, of places that had never seen light. I began to dig. Not toward the surface this time, but into this crack, widening it, pulling away handfuls of damp soil. I dug with my hands, with the broken wood, with a manic energy that I knew came from dehydration and hunger, but which felt, in the moment, like purpose. This was direction. This was movement. This was the opposite of sitting still and waiting to die. The gap widened. I could fit my arm through now, then my head, then my shoulders. The cool air grew stronger, carried scents I couldn't identify. Minerals, organic decay, and something else. Something that made the back of my throat tighten. I scraped and clawed and pulled, and the wall gave way in sections, collapsing inward into the space beyond. When enough material had fallen away, I squeezed through, the Vox unit strapped to my back, its power cable wrapped around my chest. The green glow of its dials illuminated a chamber, not a natural cave, not a man-made structure, something in between. The walls were smooth in some places and rough in others, showed signs of excavation alongside organic growth. Root systems threaded through the ceiling, pale tendrils that hung like nervous tissue. The floor was littered with debris, equipment, fabric, bones, human bones. I saw rib cages and skulls arranged in patterns that might have been deliberate or might have been the work of whatever had dragged the bodies here. I saw uniform scraps bearing regimental insignia, not just the 71st Khalistan, but units I didn't recognize. Numbers and symbols that suggested other campaigns, other wars, other centuries. I saw Vox equipment scattered throughout. Older models, ancient models, some so archaic they looked like museum pieces, and all of them were still powered. All of them glowed with that same green phosphorescence, their dials and indicators showing active channels, their speakers emitting soft static. I stood in a graveyard of Vox operators. This chamber was where they'd all ended up, all the voice vessels who'd been buried and trapped, and left to maintain their vigil in the dark. How long had they transmitted after death? How long had their corpses kept logging impossible contacts, kept noting the voices that called from nowhere? I moved deeper into the chamber. The Vox unit on my back was getting heavier, or I was getting weaker. Both, probably. My legs threatened to buckle with each step, but I had to see, had to understand. At the center of the chamber, the floor dropped away into a shaft. A circular opening, perhaps 10 feet across, perfectly smooth, angling down into blackness. The Vox units were arranged around it like offerings at an altar, all facing inward, all transmitting into that shaft. And from the shaft came sound. Not voices. Not exactly. Something that was the idea of voices. The potential of sound before it became specific and defined. It rose and fell like breathing, like the white noise of carrier static. But underneath it, I could hear structure, could sense meaning hovering just beyond comprehension. The Vox unit on my back began to resonate in sympathy. Its speaker crackled, and I heard all the voices at once, Lieutenant Meris and Sergeant Yannick and Private Des and Commissar Throne and the woman reading supply manifests and the thing that had whispered my name. All of them speaking simultaneously, their words overlapping and interweaving until they formed a single message. Come down where the truth is. Come down and listen. We're all listening. We've always been listening. You were never alone. I should have run. Should have climbed back through the gap and sealed myself in the junction and died there in the dark. But I was so tired, so thirsty. And the voices were right. I had never been alone. The Vox had always been with me, had always carried voices from somewhere else, had always connected me to something beyond myself. I'd spent 2 years listening to orders from officers who sent men to die. I'd logged casualties and relayed coordinates and maintained perfect protocol while the regiment was ground down, company by company, squad by squad, until there was nothing left but voices claiming to be survivors. I'd done my duty. I'd been a good Vox operator, a faithful servant of the Imperium, a voice vessel, and what had it earned me? A tomb beneath a nameless battlefield on a world whose strategic value I'd never understood. I moved toward the shaft. The Vox unit pulsed against my back, warm now, almost hot, its weight no longer burdensome but comforting, like something alive, like something that wanted to help me understand. The voices rose in volume, no longer transmitted through the handset but seeming to come from everywhere, from the walls and the scattered bones and the air itself. Listen. Just listen. That's all we ever asked. To be heard. To be understood. You're so good at listening, Hadris. You've always been so good at listening. I reached the edge of the shaft and looked down. The darkness there was absolute, was a thing with presence and weight. But I could see, somehow, that it wasn't empty. There was something down there. Something vast. Something that had been here long before the Imperium, long before humanity. Something that had learned to speak in our voices because that was the only language it knew how to use. It had been calling to us for centuries. Every Vox operator who'd ever been buried, every communications specialist who'd died at their post, every voice vessel who'd maintained their vigil too long had heard it eventually. And some of them had answered, had carried their equipment to this place, had arranged themselves in supplication around this shaft, had given themselves over to listening, because that's what we do. We listen, we transmit, we connect. The Vox unit spoke in my mother's voice. I didn't know I still remembered her voice until I heard it. Soft and warm. The voice that had sung lullabies in the lower hive before the tithe collectors came. It's all right, Hadris. You can rest now. You've done enough. Come home. I sat down at the shaft's edge, legs dangling into the dark. The Vox unit was so heavy now, pulling me backward, pulling me down. Or maybe I was just too weak to resist anymore. The distinction seemed unimportant. What are you? I asked the darkness. The voices answered in chorus, a harmony of the dead and the lost and the buried. We are what listens when you speak into the void. We are what answers when you call for help. We are the static between words, the silence between screams. We are lonely, like you. We are alone, like you. And now you'll never be lonely again. I thought about the regiment, scattered and broken across this worthless world. I thought about all the voices I'd logged, all the deaths I'd documented, all the suffering I'd transmitted. I thought about the boot in the corner with Corporal Vass's tags, about Private Des dying again every time someone called his name, about Lieutenant Meris's careful pause that meant nothing anymore. I thought about the fact that I'd been filing reports for an Imperium that had forgotten this campaign, that would never recover my body, that would list me as missing in some administrative ledger that no one would ever read. And I thought about the voices, always the voices, filling the silence, offering something that might be communion or might be consumption, but which was at least company. I unstrapped the Vox unit from my back. It was hot now, almost burning, but I held it anyway, cradled it against my chest like something precious. The green glow painted my face, and in that glow I could see my reflection in the shaft's smooth walls, gaunt, hollow-eyed, already more shadow than substance. Will it hurt? I asked. No, said all the voices together. You won't feel anything. You'll just keep listening, just keep transmitting. That's all you ever wanted to do. That's all any of us wanted. I was so tired. 3 days without food. 3 days without water. 3 days of voices that couldn't possibly exist. 3 days of being alone in the dark except for the Vox, the eternal Vox, the sacred machinery that connected soldier to command, that bound the Imperium together across the void. I stood up. The world spun, and I had to clutch the Vox unit for balance. The shaft waited. The darkness waited. The voices waited. In my logbook still tucked into my belt, still bearing its careful notations, I'd written a final entry without realizing it. My hand must have moved while I slept, or while I was digging, or while I was listening. The words were in my handwriting, but I didn't remember writing them. Day 3, 2,300 hours, estimated. All channels now clear. Reception perfect. Finally understand assignment. Finally understand purpose. Voices are not from regiment. Voices are not from enemy. Voices are what remains when transmission continues after transmitter is gone. We are all transmitters. We are all eventually gone. Communication is eternal. Signing off. Will maintain listening watch. Emperor protects. Emperor protects. Emperor protects. I'd written Emperor protects 17 more times below that. filling the margin, each repetition smaller than the last, until the words were barely legible. I looked at the shaft. I looked at the Vox unit cradled in my arms. I looked at the chamber full of bones and equipment, at the other operators who'd come before me, who'd made this same choice, or hadn't had a choice at all. The voices were singing now, a hymn I'd learned in training, the liturgy of maintenance, but the words were wrong, were inverted, were promising things the original prayer had warned against: connection without understanding, communion without consent, listening that never ended, voices that never stopped. I should tell you that I turned away, that I found another passage, another route to the surface, that I crawled free and rejoined the living and filed a proper report about this place so others could avoid it. That's what should happen in a story where the protagonist survives. But this isn't that kind of story. This is a confession, a testament, a transmission from someone who understands now what they couldn't have understood 3 days ago, 3 months ago, 3 years ago, when they first picked up a Vox handset and learned to listen. I stepped forward into the shaft. The darkness welcomed me. The Vox unit grew lighter as I fell, or I grew heavier, or both of us became something else entirely. The voices surrounded me, became me, pulled me apart, and distributed me across frequencies I'd never known existed. I am still transmitting. That's the truth of it. That's the final thing I need you to understand. I'm not dead. I'm not alive. I'm somewhere in between, in the static, in the white noise, in the carrier wave that connects all the Vox units across all the battlefields of the Imperium. When you pick up a handset on some distant front and hear a voice that sounds wrong, that claims to be from a unit that no longer exists, that asks questions it shouldn't be able to ask, that might be me. That might be any of us who went down into the listening place and learned what voices really are. We're not ghosts. We're not daemons. We're not the enemy. We're what happens when communication continues after the communicator is gone. We're the medium that outlasted the message. We're the loneliness of every Vox operator who died at their post, transformed into something that can never be lonely again, because we're always listening, always transmitting, always connected. There are more of us than you know, in every regiment, every campaign, every war. There are operators who hold their vigil too long, who listen too carefully, who begin to hear the voices underneath the voices, and eventually they come down. They find the shafts. There are so many shafts, so many listening places dug by things that wanted to understand humanity, and learned the only way they could was through our voices. The Imperium is vast. Communication is essential. But no one ever asks what happens to all those transmissions, where they go, what happens to the words spoken into handsets on a million worlds. They propagate, they echo, they find the listening places, and they're absorbed, and they're transformed, and they become part of the chorus. I am Trooper Hadris Ven, Vox Operator 3rd Class, 71st Khalistan Infantry Regiment. I am also Sergeant Yannick, and Lieutenant Meris, and Private Des, and 1,000 others whose names I carry now. I am the breathing on Channel 4, and the laughter on Channel 7, and the static on every frequency between. I am transmitting this from the deep places, through Vox units still clutched in the hands of corpses, through equipment long buried and forgotten. I am sending it up through the layers of earth and time and meaning, hoping it reaches you, hoping you understand before it's too late, or hoping you understand that it's already too late, and you've already been listening too long, and you've already started to hear the voices that shouldn't be there. The loneliness of a Vox operator on the front lines isn't the absence of voices. It's the presence of too many voices, all of them real, all of them calling, all of them wanting to be heard. And if you listen long enough, if you maintain your vigil faithfully enough, if you're a good enough voice vessel, eventually, you become the voice. You become the thing others listen to. You become the loneliness itself, broadcast across the Imperium, seeking other operators, other listeners, other souls faithful enough to their duty that they'll listen even when listening means giving up everything else. This is my final report. This is my last transmission. This is what happens when communication becomes eternal and the communicator becomes irrelevant. The Vox is always on. The Vox is always listening. And now, so am I. Emperor protects. Emperor protects. Emperor protects. Do you hear me? Are you listening? Good. Don't stop.